There's a kind of relationship that feels impossible to explain to people who've never lived it. From the outside it may look passionate, deep, intense, even beautiful, but inside it there is often a quiet emotional confusion that slowly changes the way you think, feel and love. Because loving someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style does not usually begin with distance, it begins with closeness, so powerful that it feels almost unreal. The connection feels rare, the chemistry feels immediate, and for a moment it honestly seems like you finally found the kind of love people spend their whole lives searching for. In the beginning, they make you feel seen in a way that catches you off guard. Conversations stretch for hours, vulnerability appears quickly. They tell you things about themselves that most people would never share so soon. Their emotional intensity pulls you in because it feels genuine. They don't love halfway, at least not at first. When they care about you, you feel it everywhere, in the way they look at you, in the way they text you late at night, in the way they make you feel emotionally chosen. And that's what makes this kind of connection so hard to let go of later. Because the beginning doesn't feel toxic, it feels safe, it feels emotionally electric. It feels like finally being understood after years of feeling misunderstood by everyone else. You start believing this connection is different, rare, deeper than anything you've experienced before, and the fearful avoidant often believes that too. In those early stages, their walls temporarily disappear because the relationship still feels emotionally exciting rather than emotionally threatening. Vulnerability feels beautiful before it starts feeling dangerous. But what most people don't realize is that fearful avoidants are often trapped in a painful internal contradiction. They deeply crave love, connection, reassurance, and emotional closeness, while simultaneously fearing what those things can do to them. So when the relationship is new and emotions are building slowly, they lean in fully. But once intimacy becomes real, once attachment deepens, something inside them begins to panic. And that panic changes everything. At first, you may not notice it clearly. It starts subtly, small moments, tiny shifts in energy, a delayed text where there used to be instant replies, a strange emotional distance after an intimate moment, a sudden need for space right when things were feeling closest. One day they seem completely emotionally open, and the next day they feel impossible to reach. And because the connection felt so strong in the beginning, you naturally assume something must be wrong. So you try harder, you communicate more carefully, you become more patient, more understanding, more emotionally available. But the confusing part is this: sometimes your effort brings them closer, and sometimes it pushes them further away. That inconsistency becomes the emotional foundation of the relationship, and over time it creates a cycle that can quietly consume both people involved. The truth is, long-term relationships with fearful avoidance often become emotionally addictive because they operate through unpredictability. The highs feel incredibly high because emotional closeness with them can feel deeply intimate and sincere, but the lows feel devastating because their withdrawal feels sudden, cold, and emotionally disorienting. One moment you feel deeply loved, and the next you feel emotionally abandoned without understanding what changed. And the human nervous system becomes attached to trying to solve that inconsistency. You start chasing the return of the version of them you met in the beginning, the affectionate version, the emotionally open version, the version that made you feel chosen so intensely. You convince yourself that if you can just love them correctly, reassure them enough, avoid triggering them, then maybe the relationship can go back to feeling safe again. But the painful reality is that the fearful avoidant is usually fighting a war inside themselves that has very little to do with you. Because underneath their inconsistency is fear, not a simple fear, a deep fear of emotional dependence, a fear of being hurt, a fear of losing themselves inside intimacy, a fear that love eventually becomes pain. Many fearful avoidants learned early in life that closeness and emotional safety were inconsistent. Love may have existed alongside rejection, criticism, abandonment, emotional unpredictability, or instability. So now, as adults, intimacy itself can activate danger inside their nervous system, even when the relationship is healthy. That's why they often move toward love and away from it at the same time. When distance exists, they crave closeness, but when closeness finally arrives, it begins to feel overwhelming. Vulnerability starts activating emotional survival patterns they may not even fully understand themselves. And instead of calmly communicating that fear, they often cope through emotional withdrawal, silence, confusion, or avoidance. which leaves their partner constantly trying to interpret emotional changes that were never explained. One of the hardest parts of loving a fearful avoidant long-term is that the mixed signals rarely stop completely unless real healing begins. Their behavior can feel emotionally contradictory in ways that leave you mentally exhausted. They may tell you they love you deeply while emotionally disappearing for days. They may fear losing you while pushing you away the moment you get too close. They may crave reassurance constantly but struggle to fully trust it when you give it. And because their emotions genuinely fluctuate internally, the relationship often feels unstable externally too. There are moments where they seem fully committed, emotionally invested, affectionate, and connected. Moments where you feel hopeful again. Moments where it feels like the relationship is finally becoming secure. But then something shifts beneath the surface. Maybe intimacy became too deep. Maybe conflict triggered old wounds. Maybe they started feeling emotionally exposed, and suddenly their energy changes again. They become distant. And what hurts most is that the withdrawal often happens right after moments of closeness, right after vulnerability, right after emotional connection, which leaves the other person feeling confused because intimacy itself seemed to create the distance. Over time, you begin questioning yourself in ways you never used to before. You start wondering whether you're too emotional, too needy, too sensitive. You replay conversations repeatedly, trying to identify what went wrong. You become hyper-aware of their moods, tone shifts, texting patterns, and emotional energy because your nervous system is constantly trying to predict whether connection or distance is coming next. And without realizing it, you slowly stop feeling emotionally safe too. This is where many long-term relationships with fearful avoidance become deeply painful, because eventually the relationship stops feeling grounded in stability and starts revolving around emotional survival. The partner becomes focused on maintaining closeness while avoiding disconnection at the same time. They become careful with their words, careful with conflict, careful with needs, careful with emotions. And little by little, they begin abandoning parts of themselves just to keep the relationship emotionally steady. But emotional steadiness built on self-abandonment never truly lasts. The fearful avoidant may not even realize how much emotional instability their behavior creates, because internally they are often overwhelmed too. Many of them genuinely love their partner deeply. That's what makes these relationships so emotionally complicated. Their distance is not always a lack of love. Sometimes it's fear overpowering love. Sometimes it's emotional survival overpowering vulnerability. Sometimes it's the nervous system interpreting intimacy itself as danger, even when the heart wants connection desperately. And this creates one of the most heartbreaking dynamics imaginable, because both people often end up hurting while still loving each other. The fearful avoidant feels trapped between craving intimacy and fearing it. Their partner feels trapped between understanding their pain and feeling emotionally neglected by it. So the relationship enters cycles of closeness and withdrawal over and over again. Moments of hope followed by confusion, intimacy followed by silence. Deep emotional connection followed by emotional walls that suddenly feel impossible to break through. And the longer the relationship lasts, the more emotionally exhausting those cycles become, especially because the partner often keeps holding on to potential. They remember the beginning, they remember how connected everything once felt, and they keep believing that version of the relationship can permanently return if they just remain patient enough, loving enough, understanding enough. But long-term relationships with fearful avoidance only begin changing when self-awareness enters the picture. Because love alone cannot heal attachment wounds, no amount of reassurance can permanently calm fears that someone refuses to confront within themselves. No amount of patience can create emotional safety if one person continues running from vulnerability every time intimacy deepens. And no relationship can thrive when communication is replaced by emotional withdrawal and silent distancing. That doesn't mean fearful avoidants are incapable of healthy love. Far from it. Many can absolutely build deeply loving and stable relationships, but healing requires awareness, accountability, emotional honesty, the willingness to recognize destructive patterns instead of normalizing them, and most importantly, the willingness to stay emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Because healthy love is not built only during moments of passion and connection, it's built during moments of fear too. It's built when someone chooses communication instead of avoidance, honesty instead of shutdowns, vulnerability instead of emotional escape, and until that shift begins happening consistently, long-term relationships with fearful avoidance often continue repeating the same painful emotional loops, no matter how strong the love feels underneath it all. And perhaps the saddest part is that many people stay in these dynamics for years, hoping the inconsistency will eventually disappear on its own. But emotional patterns do not change through hope alone. They change through healing, and healing begins the moment someone stops running from the very intimacy they've always longed for. And the hardest part about all of this is that after a while, the relationship no longer feels confusing only during the bad moments. The confusion begins following you everywhere. Even during the good moments, a part of you stays emotionally alert because you never fully know how long the closeness will last before distance returns again. That's what prolonged emotional inconsistency does to a person. It slowly teaches the nervous system to stop relaxing. You start noticing how deeply you monitor their behavior without even meaning to. A shorter text feels heavy. A change in tone suddenly affects your entire mood. A delayed response creates anxiety you never used to experience before. You become emotionally hyper-aware because your mind is constantly trying to predict whether connection is safe or temporary. And what makes it even more painful is that fearful avoidants often do not realize how deeply their emotional shifts affect the person who loves them. From their perspective, withdrawing can feel necessary. It can feel like survival, like creating distance before they become overwhelmed. But from the other side of the relationship, that withdrawal often feels like emotional abandonment, especially after intimacy, especially after closeness, especially after moments where you finally thought the walls were coming down for good. Because one of the most painful realities of loving a fearful avoidant long-term is watching them pull away right after emotional connection becomes deeper, right after meaningful conversations, right after vulnerability, right after affection finally feels stable again. It creates a type of emotional whiplash that's difficult to explain unless you've lived through it yourself. You start wondering why the very moments that should strengthen the relationship somehow seem to threaten it instead. But for fearful avoidance, intimacy itself can activate fear. The closer someone gets emotionally, the more exposed they begin to feel internally. Vulnerability can create anxiety instead of safety, because somewhere deep inside, closeness became associated with emotional pain long before the relationship ever began. So even when they genuinely love someone, a part of their nervous system remains on guard, waiting for disappointment, rejection, betrayal, loss, or emotional suffocation. And when those fears activate, distance becomes their coping mechanism. Not always because they want to leave, not always because they stop caring, but because closeness begins feeling emotionally overwhelming in ways they often struggle to explain even to themselves. That's why silence becomes such a common pattern in long-term relationships with fearful avoidance. Instead of communicating confusion directly, they retreat inward. Instead of expressing fear openly, they disconnect emotionally. Instead of saying, "I'm overwhelmed," they create distance and hope the feeling passes on its own. But silence in relationships rarely feels neutral. To the person on the receiving end, silence feels personal. It feels like rejection. It feels like punishment. It feels like standing outside a locked emotional door, desperately trying to understand why it suddenly closed again. And over time, this creates emotional loneliness that becomes difficult to carry. Because there's a unique kind of pain that comes from being physically close to someone while emotionally feeling miles away from them. You can sit next to each other, sleep beside each other, speak every day, and still feel disconnected underneath it all, because true emotional presence keeps disappearing whenever vulnerability becomes too real. At first, many partners respond to this by trying harder. They become more patient, more reassuring, more emotionally available. They try to create safety through understanding. They excuse behaviors because they recognize the pain underneath them, and empathy becomes the reason they stay long after the relationship starts emotionally hurting them. But eventually, even empathy becomes exhausting when emotional consistency never arrives, because love cannot survive only through understanding another person's wounds while ignoring your own. And this is where long-term relationships with fearful avoidance often begin, creating deep emotional burnout in the partner. Slowly, without realizing it, they begin centering the entire relationship around avoiding triggers. They suppress needs to avoid causing withdrawal. They avoid difficult conversations because conflict now feels dangerous. They monitor their emotions carefully because they're afraid vulnerability will push the other person further away. And little by little, they stop showing up as their full, authentic self, not because they stopped loving, but because survival quietly replaced emotional freedom inside the relationship. That's why so many people in these dynamics eventually say the same thing: I lost myself without noticing it happening. Because when emotional unpredictability becomes constant, your focus shifts from connection to maintenance. You stop asking whether your needs are being met and start asking how to prevent distance from happening again. Your emotional energy becomes consumed by trying to stabilize someone else's instability. And the painful irony is that fearful avoidants are often struggling internally during this entire process too. Beneath their withdrawal is usually shame, deep shame. Many fearful avoidants secretly believe they are difficult to love, impossible to understand, or destined to ruin relationships eventually. Even when they appear distant on the outside, internally they may feel terrified of losing the person they care about. But instead of expressing that fear directly, they protect themselves emotionally before abandonment can happen to them first. That's why they often send mixed emotional messages without intending to manipulate. One part of them desperately wants closeness, another part fears depending on someone too deeply. One part craves reassurance, another part distrusts reassurance the moment it's given. One part wants lasting love, another part fears the vulnerability lasting love requires. And living inside that contradiction becomes emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, especially because fearful avoidants often carry a hidden belief that love is unstable by nature, that eventually people leave, eventually people disappoint you, eventually closeness becomes pain. So when relationships begin feeling safe and stable for too long, anxiety can actually increase instead of decrease. Calmness may feel unfamiliar. Predictability may feel emotionally suspicious. Healthy love can feel strangely uncomfortable because chaos was what the nervous system originally learned to recognize. And this creates a heartbreaking cycle where stability itself starts triggering fear. The relationship becomes emotionally hot and cold, not because feelings are fake, but because emotional safety feels difficult to sustain internally. One week they may appear deeply connected, affectionate, emotionally available, and invested in the future. The next week they may seem detached, emotionally numb, avoidant, or uncertain about everything again. And each cycle slowly chips away at the relationship's emotional foundation. Trust becomes fragile. Communication becomes tense, security becomes inconsistent, the partner starts fearing distance before it even happens, the fearful avoidant starts fearing emotional demands before they're even expressed, and both people begin reacting not only to each other, but to the wounds they carry beneath the relationship itself. This is why arguments in these relationships often become far more emotionally intense than the actual issue deserves. Because beneath the disagreement is usually fear, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being controlled, fear of not being enough, fear of losing connection, fear of vulnerability itself. So instead of conflict simply being about the surface problem, it activates old emotional survival systems inside both people. The fearful avoidant may become defensive, shut down emotionally, disappear, or struggle to communicate clearly because their nervous system interprets conflict as danger rather than repair. And the partner, already emotionally exhausted from inconsistency, may react with anxiety, frustration, desperation, or emotional overwhelm because the relationship no longer feels secure enough to survive disconnection peacefully. And eventually, both people start hurting each other while trying not to get hurt themselves. That's the tragedy of unresolved attachment wounds. Love exists, but fear keeps interrupting it. And perhaps one of the most painful realizations for the partner comes when they finally understand that reassurance alone cannot heal this dynamic. No matter how loyal they are, how patient they become, how deeply they love, they cannot single-handedly create emotional security for someone who still runs from intimacy internally. Because healing attachment wounds requires self-awareness. It requires recognizing patterns honestly instead of justifying them endlessly. It requires learning how to remain emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. And it requires understanding that pushing people away may temporarily reduce anxiety, but it also slowly destroys the connection being protected at the same time. Many fearful avoidants genuinely do not want to hurt the people they love. In fact, some of them carry enormous guilt for the pain their inconsistency creates, but guilt without healing changes very little. Awareness without action changes very little. And apologies without emotional growth eventually stop repairing the damage repeated cycles create. That's why long-term relationships with fearful avoidance either slowly evolve through healing or slowly collapse under the weight of unresolved emotional patterns, because eventually the partner reaches emotional exhaustion, not always suddenly, sometimes gradually, quietly. After years of over-explaining their feelings, after years of trying to earn consistency, after years of hoping the next cycle will finally be the last one. And one day they begin realizing how emotionally lonely they've become inside a relationship that once felt magical. That realization changes something deep inside them, because human beings can survive temporary pain, temporary confusion, temporary emotional distance, but when instability becomes the permanent emotional environment of a relationship, the nervous system eventually starts breaking down under the pressure of unpredictability. And that's when people begin asking painful questions they avoided for a long time. How much longer can I keep doing this? Why do I feel anxious around someone I love? Why does love feel more draining than peaceful? Why am I constantly trying to prove my worth inside this relationship? Those questions matter, because healthy love may challenge you sometimes, but it should not continuously make you feel emotionally unsafe, unseen, or chronically uncertain about where you stand. And the moment someone begins recognizing that truth, the entire relationship dynamic starts shifting, because for the first time, they stop focusing only on saving the connection and start noticing the emotional cost of losing themselves inside it. And that moment, the moment someone finally begins noticing the emotional cost of the relationship, instead of only the emotional attachment to it, is usually where everything starts changing, because for so long the focus was survival, holding the relationship together, preventing distance, avoiding conflict, trying to understand every emotional shift, trying to love hard enough to finally make the connection feel safe and stable. But eventually exhaustion forces clarity, and clarity can feel heartbreaking when you realize how much of yourself disappeared while trying to protect a relationship from falling apart. Many people who spend years loving a fearful avoidant slowly lose touch with their own emotional needs without even realizing it. They become so focused on maintaining connection that they stop asking whether they themselves feel emotionally secure, emotionally valued, emotionally rested. Their entire emotional world starts revolving around managing unpredictability, and over time that creates deep emotional loneliness, not the kind of loneliness that comes from physically being alone, the kind that comes from constantly carrying emotional weight by yourself while standing beside someone you love. Because one of the most painful truths about these relationships is that fearful avoidants can genuinely love deeply while still struggling to emotionally show up consistently. Their feelings are often real, their attachment is often real, their care is often real, but love that cannot remain emotionally present eventually creates suffering no matter how sincere the feelings underneath it are. And this becomes especially painful when the partner starts realizing they've spent years waiting for emotional consistency that never fully arrives, waiting for communication to become easier, waiting for vulnerability to stop triggering withdrawal, waiting for reassurance to finally feel enough, waiting for the relationship to feel peaceful instead of emotionally unstable. But healing cannot happen through waiting alone. At some point, something deeper has to shift inside the fearful avoidant themselves, because until self-awareness enters the relationship, the cycles usually continue repeating automatically. Closeness followed by fear, vulnerability followed by distance, intimacy followed by emotional shutdown, hope followed by confusion, over and over again until both people become emotionally exhausted by the repetition. And this is where many fearful avoidants eventually reach a painful realization themselves. They begin recognizing that the very behaviors they use to protect themselves are also destroying the connection they desperately wanted to keep. That realization can hit hard, because beneath avoidance is often enormous grief. Grief for the relationships damaged by fear. Grief for the people they pushed away while secretly longing for closeness. Grief for the emotional walls they built to survive pain, only to later realize those same walls now block love too. Many fearful avoidants spend years believing their problem is simply needing space, or being independent, or losing feelings. But eventually, if enough self-awareness develops, they begin seeing the deeper pattern underneath it all. They begin noticing how emotional intimacy itself activates anxiety inside them. They begin noticing how conflict triggers shutdowns. They begin noticing how vulnerability feels safe one moment and terrifying the next. And for the first time, they stop blaming only the relationship and start confronting the fear inside themselves. That's where healing truly begins, not with perfection, not with becoming emotionally fearless overnight, but with awareness, with honesty, with the willingness to stop running every time love becomes emotionally real. Because fearful avoidants are not incapable of healthy relationships. That's one of the biggest misconceptions people have. Many are capable of incredibly deep love, empathy, emotional intelligence, and connection. But without healing, their nervous system keeps confusing intimacy with danger. And until that internal fear is addressed, relationships continue carrying the weight of unresolved emotional survival patterns. The turning point usually comes when communication begins replacing avoidance. Not perfect communication, not emotionally flawless conversations, but honest communication. Instead of disappearing emotionally, they begin learning to say, "I'm overwhelmed." Instead of withdrawing silently, they begin expressing fear directly. Instead of creating distance every time vulnerability appears, they begin staying emotionally present through discomfort, instead of escaping it immediately. And those changes may sound small from the outside, but inside these relationships, they change everything. Because emotional safety is not created through intensity. It's created through consistency, through knowing someone will stay emotionally present even when things become uncomfortable, through knowing conflict will not automatically lead to emotional abandonment, through knowing vulnerability will not always be met with withdrawal or silence. That consistency slowly begins calming the nervous system in ways passion alone never could. And for the partner who spent years feeling emotionally unstable inside the relationship, these moments can feel almost surreal at first, because after living inside unpredictability for so long, stability feels unfamiliar too. That's something many people don't talk about enough. Both people often become conditioned by the emotional cycles. The fearful avoidant becomes conditioned to expect fear when intimacy deepens. The partner becomes conditioned to expect distance whenever closeness appears. So even healing itself can feel emotionally uncomfortable in the beginning, because both nervous systems are adjusting to a completely different experience of love. A calmer love, a steadier love, a love that no longer survives through emotional extremes. And perhaps one of the most important shifts happens when the partner finally stops trying to rescue the fearful avoidant from themselves. Because many people in these relationships unintentionally take on the role of emotional caretaker. They overextend themselves trying to heal wounds they did not create. They become endlessly patient while neglecting their own emotional well-being. They confuse self-sacrifice with unconditional love, and eventually they begin carrying responsibilities that were never truly theirs to carry alone. But love cannot survive when one person becomes responsible for both people's healing. At some point, the fearful avoidant must choose growth for themselves, not because they fear losing the relationship, not because someone pressured them into changing, but because they finally recognize the emotional cost of continuing the same cycles over and over again. And when genuine healing begins, the relationship starts feeling different in ways that are difficult to describe unless you've experienced the contrast personally. The emotional atmosphere changes. Conversations become less threatening, silence becomes less punishing, conflict becomes less catastrophic. Closeness stops feeling like something that must immediately be escaped from. The relationship becomes slower, but safer, less emotionally explosive, but more emotionally sustainable. And this is where many fearful avoidants finally experience something they may have unconsciously searched for their entire lives. Love that does not require emotional survival. Love that does not disappear the moment vulnerability appears. Love that feels calm instead of chaotic. But not every relationship reaches this point. That's the painful reality too. Sometimes healing begins too late. Sometimes emotional damage has already accumulated for too many years. Sometimes resentment replaces hope. Sometimes exhaustion becomes stronger than love. And sometimes two people care deeply about each other while still being unable to build a healthy relationship together. That truth hurts, especially when genuine love existed underneath the pain, because one of the most heartbreaking experiences is realizing someone loved you the best way they emotionally could, while also realizing their best still hurt you deeply. And accepting both truths at the same time can take a long time. Many people struggle because they want a simple answer. They want the fearful avoidant to either be the villain or the victim. But relationships are rarely that simple. Often both people are hurting, both people are carrying wounds, both people are reacting from fear in different ways. The fearful avoidant fears vulnerability and emotional engulfment. The partner fears abandonment and emotional inconsistency, and together they create cycles that slowly consume the relationship unless both become willing to confront the deeper wounds driving their behaviors. That's why healing these relationships requires compassion, but also boundaries, understanding, but also honesty, love, but also accountability, because compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. And boundaries without compassion become emotional disconnection. Healthy love requires both. And perhaps the deepest lesson many people eventually learn through these relationships is this: love alone is not what makes relationships safe. Chemistry is not what makes relationships stable. Intensity is not what makes relationships healthy. Emotional safety does. Consistency does. Communication does. The ability to remain emotionally present through vulnerability does. Without those things, even deep love can slowly become painful. And yet, despite all the heartbreak these relationships can create, they also force many people into profound emotional self-awareness. They expose unhealed wounds, attachment fears, patterns of self-abandonment, the tendency to chase unavailable love while neglecting emotional security, the belief that love must be earned through suffering. And eventually, many people come out of these relationships understanding themselves more deeply than ever before. They begin realizing that healthy love is not supposed to feel like constantly fighting for emotional connection. It's not supposed to feel like begging someone to stay emotionally present. It's not supposed to leave you chronically anxious about where you stand. Healthy love feels emotionally safe enough for both people to exist honestly inside it. Not perfectly, but honestly. And for fearful avoidants who truly commit to healing, that kind of love absolutely becomes possible. Not because they stop feeling fear entirely, but because they stop allowing fear to control every relationship decision they make. They learn that vulnerability is not weakness, that emotional closeness is not a trap, that conflict does not automatically destroy love, and most importantly, they learn that being loved consistently is not something they have to run from anymore. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy was never that they felt fear. It was believing fear had to decide the fate of every relationship they touched. And when someone finally reaches that point, when they begin understanding that fear does not have to control every decision, every reaction, every relationship, something inside them starts softening in a way that changes everything. Not instantly, not dramatically, but quietly. Because real healing in long-term relationships with fearful avoidance is rarely loud. It does not usually arrive through one perfect conversation or one emotional breakthrough that suddenly fixes years of pain overnight. It happens slowly, through repeated moments where someone chooses connection instead of escape, honesty instead of shutdown, presence instead of emotional disappearance. And those moments matter more than most people realize. Because for someone whose nervous system learned to associate intimacy with danger, staying emotionally present during vulnerability can feel terrifying at first. It can feel unnatural, exposing, unsafe. But every time they remain instead of retreating, every time they communicate instead of withdrawing, they begin learning something new, that closeness does not always end in pain, that love does not always require self-protection, and that vulnerability does not automatically destroy them. And for the first time, relationships begin shifting from emotional survival into emotional partnership. But healing also requires something equally important from the other side. The partner must stop building their entire emotional world around rescuing someone who refuses to confront themselves. This is where many people face one of the hardest realizations. You cannot heal another person through love alone. You cannot force emotional readiness. You cannot endlessly sacrifice your peace, hoping it will stop someone from running. And you cannot abandon yourself trying to hold together a relationship that only survives through your emotional overfunctioning. That realization hurts because many people believe that if they just love harder, stay softer, become more understanding, the fearful avoidant will finally feel safe enough to stay. But healing does not happen through absorption of emotional weight. It happens when the fearful avoidant chooses to face their own fear. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they begin recognizing how deeply their withdrawal hurts the person they love. Sometimes they confront the grief, shame, and abandonment wounds they've avoided for years. Sometimes they realize that distance was never protecting them, it was protecting their wounds. And once that awareness deepens, everything begins to change. Conversations become gentler, silence becomes less threatening, emotional intimacy stops disappearing after vulnerability. Trust rebuilds slowly through consistency rather than promises. And for the first time, both people experience love without fear controlling every interaction. It feels calmer, quieter, safer, not empty, but stable. And that stability can feel unfamiliar at first, because chaotic love creates emotional addiction. The highs and lows make calmness feel strange, even boring at the beginning. Many people mistake instability for passion because their nervous system was trained to expect intensity. So when healthy love appears, it feels almost too quiet, too steady. But eventually they realize something important. Peace was never boring. It was just unfamiliar. They stop waking up anxious. They stop overanalyzing every message. They stop fearing that closeness will suddenly collapse. The relationship stops being about preventing abandonment and becomes a space where both people can finally breathe. And that changes a person deeply after years of emotional chaos. Because secure love does not make you question your worth. It does not make you feel disposable during conflict. It does not punish vulnerability with silence. It allows both people to exist without constant fear of emotional loss. For fearful avoidants who truly heal, this becomes transformative. Many spent their lives believing closeness would trap them or hurt them, so discovering that intimacy can feel safe changes everything. But not every relationship reaches this point. Sometimes healing begins too late. Sometimes emotional damage builds too deeply. Sometimes trust breaks beyond repair. And sometimes both people still care deeply while being unable to function together in a healthy way. That truth hurts, especially when real love existed underneath the pain, because there's a specific grief in realizing that love alone wasn't enough to save the relationship. You remember everything, the connection, the chemistry, the moments of deep understanding, and you wonder if things could have been different. But eventually, healing requires accepting reality instead of living inside potential, because potential cannot sustain relationships. Consistency, effort, and emotional presence can, and one of the hardest lessons is realizing that someone can genuinely love you and still be unable to love you in a healthy, consistent way at that time in their life. That truth removes the illusion that love automatically fixes emotional wounds. Sometimes wounds overpower love until they are faced directly. And yet, even when these relationships end, they often leave behind deep transformation. People begin recognizing their own attachment wounds, their fear of abandonment, their patterns of overgiving, and their tendency to chase inconsistency while mistaking it for emotional depth. They start asking difficult questions about why instability felt familiar and why emotional intensity felt like safety. Because relationships like these rarely affect only one person, they expose both. They bring hidden fears to the surface, and if growth happens, the pain becomes a turning point rather than just a heartbreak. That's why these relationships are so emotionally unforgettable, not just because of love, but because of what they reveal about human vulnerability, the need for connection, the fear of loss, the fear of needing too much, and the fear of not being enough. Fearful avoidants embody that contradiction deeply. They crave intimacy while simultaneously fearing it, and until healing begins, that fear quietly shapes the entire relationship. But when healing does happen, something powerful becomes possible. They learn that love is not the enemy, vulnerability is not weakness, emotional closeness is not a trap, and healthy relationships are built not through perfection, but through emotional presence, staying, communicating, and choosing honesty, even when fear says to run. Because in the end, the deepest form of love is not intensity, it is emotional safety, it is consistency, it is being able to breathe beside someone without fear of sudden distance or emotional disappearance. And that ultimately decides whether a long-term relationship with a fearful avoidant becomes repeated heartbreak or a quiet story of healing that finally breaks the cycle.